This last session addresses in various ways something that has come up during our discussions as sort of the capstone of everything that goes wrong. And that is the financial system. Andrew Sheng is a person who, over the last 6 or 8 years, has moved from the position of a central banker to the position of a major critic of central banks. And that's what you're going to be hearing about. Once you're ready, are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Okay, go ahead. I will leave it to you and I will come back later on.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. We had very tough 3 days. Tough, I mean, really trying to understand such brilliant and wise, and particularly, I think I want to congratulate Iriki-san. I have to call him Sensei. He's really a master. In the East, you've heard me say this before. In the West, you start with a joke. In the West, in the East, we start with an apology. So I apologize. Mine is the last of the lectures, and I don't know how to repeat any of all the brilliant things that I've heard and I've really learned. So I apologize if I say certain things that are probably late afternoon. I'm going to be offending somebody or something like that. Now I think Sander wants me to talk about finance, but actually finance is only one part of it, but it's also a very critical part. It's a very critical part. Because how we think about finance, and this is I'm only an accountant. I'm not a computer scientist. I don't understand physics, mathematics, etc. But let me very quickly run through what we're doing. I mean, as I said, I have an apology to make. What is the illusion, right? What is the control issue? There is an illusion of reductionism because we reduce everything to simplicity because the world is too complex, right? Like Brian Arthur says, everything is uncertainty. So we reduce it to simplicity. But in reducing it to simplicity, we get into deep trouble, right? So, when we talk about illusion of control, the slave has no illusions whatsoever. He knows he's being controlled. Okay? So, it depends on who is talking where you have the illusion or non-illusion. Now, as Jan has said, I really want to thank Jan for introducing me to all this new stuff. I became a kid in a Christmas shop, right? He invited me to one of the second, I think, of the Paralimes. And, when I started listening about biology and all this, and then I told him at a coffee break, I said, look, the East-West is about to fracture. And we really must have a conference. And so he actually arranged this conference. And then there was this disrupted balance discussion. And then the last one, which we did during the pandemic, which was buying time for climate change. Because we all agreed, all of us, that the real challenge before us is climate change. Well, it's not, right? I mean, because, we're now at war and there's inflation, etc. So the third issue that I really want to think about is why is it that the West and the East cannot get on? Now, when I say East, I really mean China, because I understand a little bit about Indian culture and, a little bit about Islamic, but I really, my Eastern part is basically Chinese. So I just want to explain this. So it's atomism versus the systemic Tao. That's a hint. And what is the quantum balance sheet? And I'll explain that. And then systems thinking. We're all, Paralimes is about system thinking. And I want to introduce this term called open giant complex systems, which seems very complex, but it's actually a very simple concept. And then leverage points and acupuncture. So finally, I will say, look, let's not be pessimistic. Let's be optimistic. What can we do about this? Okay. So, following Sander, I mean, why are we blind to our blindness, right? There's a lot of quotation from Kahneman. And this is a personal journey, okay? This is a personal journey because other than, growing up on the island of Borneo, I have not been educated in Chinese. That's 100% educated in English. went to university in Bristol, in England, then worked for an American firm as an accountant, and then started working in central banking. Okay, so my background has always been accounting and finance. The only difference between the modern central banker and the old style central banker is the old style central banker starts at the bottom and understand how the plumbing works. And today's central banker, as wonderful PhDs, they don't understand how the plumbing works. And if the plumbing goes wrong, you're going to have some deep trouble in your system. So what I also want to say is that illusion and reality is binary. As well as control, and being controlled is also another binary. And what we see in this world in reality is the interaction, the recursive loop between binaries. So it's not about 1 or 2, it's about the interaction between 1 and 2 to produce 3. And that's Tao Te Ching. Okay? From nothing, it comes 1. From 1, it becomes 2. From 2, it becomes 3, and 3 becomes 10,000 things, everything. So life is all about increasing complexity, which is the entropy law, which is the second law of thermodynamics, right? And now if you really think about this interaction issue, is exactly where today's science or the classical science misses out, right? Now reductionism, as you've heard it, creates closed captions because the binary thinks that there is a very clear divisible line between good and evil, between positive and negative, whereas actually everything is a continuum and it's a 5,000 shades of gray, right? It's not black and white. Now that's where the closed is fragile and the open is emergence. Okay? So once we begin to see this, we all have to tell stories. So essentially, we, post the 1500 or 1650, science started telling a quantitative narrative, ignoring the qualitative narrative of the humanities. So much so that C.P. Snow said, look, there are 2 cultures, but there are not 2 cultures. And this is what I want to very quickly run. So the problem with all this is even simplicity is complex. You need very complex brains to understand very simple things, and you need very simple brains to understand very complex things. It's actually interactive, right? Now, Stephen Toulmin, who is the Stephen Toulmin, there we are. Sorry, Stephen Toulmin, who is this Oxford professor of the history of science, basically said, modernity, which he placed at starting around 1650 to around Newton period, right? Basically became extremely theoretical. Things were supposed to be universal laws. It's theoretical. It is timeless, and it is wrong, because in reality, we have now moved into uncertainty, the quantum stage, whereby even the smallest atom, which we thought was a particle, we're not even sure whether it's a wave, right? So when you go into the micro, you suddenly find it gets more and more complex. And when you get to the macro, out into the stars, you suddenly find that the trillions, maybe trillions of stars, right? So the issue is, so we really need to move out of this comprehensive system of theory with universal timeless relevance to be more best frame, practical, and fight the intellectual reductionism. And when I read Stephen Toulmin, I said, wow, he's got it. Okay, so, things cannot be, simple. Those we see. So now the first stage, why are we in this mess, right? Why are we alphas fighting in a burning planet? I mean, this is, it really is, alphas is probably a polite word, right? Here is Hanun and Ditus, colleagues of mine, not colleagues, but respected central bankers at the BIS. That's right, the BIS. And when they retired, they wrote this book called Revolution Required: The Ticking Time Bomb of the G7 Model. And the world is fragile. world economy is struggling, et cetera, essentially we have lost control at the individual, the firm, the community, the market, and the global level. So, I mean, we've talked about all this, I've just shown you a cartoon. We are building sandcastles on the beach, right? The first wave is the COVID, the second wave is the recession, the third wave is climate change, and the fourth wave is probably war, okay? So either we are, burning, I mean, the burning, the frog, slowly being boiled, and why are we having this? It's because we are transiting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, and that transition is somewhat chaotic, okay? And the fundamental reason is that we are all to blame. As Dan said, I mean, nobody's at fault, but everybody's to blame, right? Or is it the other way around, Dan? Anyway, we have trained to be in silos. Actually, the illusion of control is the illusion of top-down silos. We think from the top, we build these silos, we will solve the problem. And so every department, every agency, every brilliant guy will say, you give me more money, I'll solve the problem for you. I guarantee you he won't solve it, right? So now, how did this financial crisis come in? And only, as Sander said, only when I got involved in climate change and started beginning to understand geopolitics and started reading Roman history, I said, wow, finance is at the heart of power, because power, money, energy is really about human hierarchy. You're a second dog, you're the third dog, I'm the top alpha, you obey. That's the way it is, right? So I came here to Stockholm when Jan invited me. I said, I want to meet Greta Thunberg. I wish, I totally admire her. She has 2 billion followers. But I have one problem. The youth can complain, but what is the solution? And that is the area, in which the other guy has no answers, right? So this is the book that I think was a revolution for me. Okay, the 6 of us, right? Many of this in this room, sat down every 2 weeks on the webinar and tried to figure out how do we buy time. And in essence, we came up to very simple solutions. We identified it. There is no shortage of technology to solve the problem. There is no shortage of money. I'm the guy who sees this. If the central bank can print $7 trillion just like that, and during the COVID, they add another 3 trillion just like that, why can't they give any money, even including 100 billion on climate change? Answer, politics. And, it's not invented here. Sorry, I won't give it to you. I think we've heard Helga say this, right? On research issues. So money is not reaching where it is needed, right? And technology is not going where it is needed. It's going to the elite, right? The AI ChatGPT will create a few billionaires and the rest of us will pay for it. There's guaranteed that, right? So the transmission channel of money and technology, knowledge and money, is not going to the masses. The last 40 years of neoliberalism is all about feeding the top 10%, more especially the 1%. Okay? So if you really look at climate change, I think I can't remember who did it, maybe Sheng or Sander talking about the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Global Trends 2040. Climate change, environmental degradation, eroding human security, and you see this all due to carbon. So even the intelligence guys get it. The future will be about climate change. But here's the money issue. Here's the money issue. It took me quite a while to figure this one out. How did we start spending so much money? If we were on a gold standard, the war would stop today because we run out of gold. We can only fight each other because we're fighting somebody's printing the money. So we are spending more the resources of this world because we can borrow. And why can we borrow? Because we can print. Now that is very important. Last night I met Lars Larsson from Sweden, and he was brilliant. You know, he's an inventor in Sweden, and we're on this Zoom chat. And he said, look, I was asked to look at a forest investment. And on an arithmetic return on a forest is 3%. But the investor said, I need a minimum of 12% return ROE. Oh, by the way, it's better if it's 25%. I said, no problem. You just leverage your transaction, you will get 25%. It's dependent upon number of leverage. So suddenly it struck me, hell, excess consumption is due to excess borrowing. So as long as central bankers are willing to print money, we will always consume more and we will kill ourselves that way. So central bankers cannot run away from that. But I cannot persuade my fellow central bankers because every one of them says, we must preserve our independence. We are the high priests of finance. We preserve our independence. Resource allocation is for the Ministry of Finance to handle. Hello, you're in charge of the interest rate. The interest rate is the price of money. The price of money is supposed to allocate to the most efficient market. At the zero interest rate level, there is no resource allocation, right? You don't know who to allocate to. The price of the future is the same as the price today, which technically speaking means that at zero interest rate, number one, we are practicing Islamic finance. And number two, there is no usury at zero interest rate. And number two, we should be able to borrow everything to do finance, the climate change, dealing with the inequality and generate even all the growth or deal with the carbon emissions, etc. We don't do that because that's not my problem. It's somebody else to blame. Okay? So now, we have the problem that the consumption is outpacing available resources already probably at the 1.6%, 1.6 Earth level. Why I got into climate change was I was in India giving a lecture after Larry Summers. Larry Summers said, we Americans are responsible for all the carbon emission, but you guys are the new guys, you pay for the carbon emission in the future. And of course, our argumentative Indian friend says, no, that's not fair, right? And then it struck me, if every Chinese, if every Indian, if every African, if every, non-West people consume like the average American or the Westerner, we need 4 Earths. Okay? It's impossible. But the master literature doesn't talk like that. Because how do you tell the Indians or the Chinese that you cannot have a GDP, half of that of the United States or Europe, right? So we're in a really, difficult problem. And look at how we solve the problem. We must have sustainable development goals, 17. You know how many, sorry, this is very badly printed, but the problem with these high-level principles, these are designed, I apologize for this, brilliant PhDs who have never worked down in their lives and getting their hands dirty, because if you worked in any bureaucracy to translate one objective to an actual project or program that is implementable, is disaster, very difficult. Having worked for democratic governments, we all know any democratic government can solve only 3 problems in their first 5 years. If you can't even solve those 3 problems, forget it. What does the World Bank or IMF give you in terms of loan conditionality? 1,000 plus conditions. It's impossible for any government to go and implement all these issues. So now let's talk about the paradigm. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not running too fast or too slow. So the paradigm problem is the key. So what's the paradigm? Any system has 4 parts. Again, I'm being reductionist. Okay? You divide it into 4 parts. The first part is the meta, the mindset paradigm, the way you look at the problem, right? The second one is the macro, the big picture. You know, that's macroeconomics. Okay? I started using this through economics. Meta-economics, macroeconomics, microeconomics. Nobody blames microeconomics for going wrong. Well, the microeconomic, the model is very simplifying assumptions. And if these assumptions are right, you agree with the assumptions, the model is right, right? So nobody argues with this. You can have very different results. The mezzo is the institutional framework that links the macro with the micro, right? You have a macro policy objective, you create a central bank to deal with the macro monetary policy to ensure that you influence micro behavior. Get it? Right? So, you know, there's a Department of Environment, there's a Department of Water, etc. All mezzo. The trouble with the mezzo, and including the market is also mezzo, is that it always carries the paradigm that is lag. Right? The paradigm is very slow to change because everybody's conservative. And then the paradigm is actually embedded in the institution. The trouble with the institution, and this is where Hayek was right, Hayek did not like totalitarianism, so he said the market has self-order. What he forgot was bureaucracy has also got self-order. The minute the bureaucracy decides that it wants to survive, its own self-order actually very often negates its original mission. And as Elizabeth says, once that bureaucracy gets corrupted because the paradigm or the values are corrupted, God help us all, right? So we're in this state. Now let's quickly show you why central bankers went wrong. They created a DSGE model. You know, dynamics, dynamically stochastic general equilibrium model. This dynamic model with massive equations has no finance in it. They use this model to explain the GDP, and they never saw the 2008 crisis coming. Okay? Now, how stupid can that be? But nobody's to blame. Nobody got sacked, right? As you know, 2008, too big to fail, too big to jail, right? Nobody, you know, no problem. And that's why today, I asked the question about AI. When AI manipulates the market, who is to blame? I don't know. There's no person. What's the effect? Who is the victim? Everybody is the victim, but no single person is the victim, right? So we have this problem. And that's where Julian Tent, again quoted by Sander, right? You know, says, you know, Alvin Toffler, Future Shock. One of the highest developed civilizations split up problems into their smallest possible components, but we forget to put the pieces back in again. We break it up, we don't put it back up to see what it adds up. This is 101 basic empirical science, not followed. I just go down that rabbit hole, I get what a simple correlation, and then I say, that's my brilliant result. Wrong, because it doesn't add up, right? And then Immanuel Kant wasn't wrong. He was saying, you know, the parts exist and by means of the whole, and the whole exists by means of the parts. It's a Kantian whole, right? So, you know, as I was saying, you know, I was making a joke. When you see a photographer taking us as a group, we tend to forget the photographer because the photographer is part of the whole, right? So what we did was quantification ignored quality, right? And you know, we were so obsessed or entranced by science that we ignored the humanities. And so therefore, why we are divided today is between the logical people and the foreign affairs called realists and the emotion, right? Okay, so this is a serious issue. So let's very quickly run through this. This is the only thing that comes even nearest to what, you know, Atsushi has done, you know. So the Western scientific paradigm comes from the Greeks, and then went to Newton, and it basically became deterministic, mechanical, linear. It's reductionist,
It's either or, it's zero sum, it treats units, atoms as inanimate, okay? And then, it basically, ignores uncertainty where possible, and it looks for optimality. And then the economics are stuck there. Sorry, I beg your pardon. The economics is basically stuck there because since then, physics, biological science have moved here into quantum and uncertainty, but economics is still general equilibrium, mechanical models. So now, where does the atomistic part come in? Well, the Western physics thinking started with the atom, right? So it's object-based particle, so it is reductionism, right? But it talks about absolutes, and it finds contradictions weird. It doesn't like contradictions. It just wants absolute black or white, right? And it's determined. But in reality, if you're a biologist, you suddenly find, hello, it's not like that. It's getting more and more complex, right? And the quantum whole means that the whole is always affected, right? It's non-deterministic, all right? So we're all in this area. Now, this is not my field. But Niels Bohr, when he was granted the Nobel Prize and was awarded, he had a coat of arms which included the Chinese yin yang. And his idea was opposites are complementary. As Nick Oblensky said, it's not either or, it's either or and. And that's very much the Asian way of thinking, right? So currently today, the West sees the East as holographic evil and vice versa. Okay? And if you don't talk to each other, the polarization will get us into another Thucydides trap, whereas we really should be cooperating. Now, where does this come from? Number one, in the West, and this I attribute to my friends here who taught me this, it starts with the Genesis 1:28 or 1:26. God made man and made you to rule over everything else. The Asian tradition doesn't have that. The Asian tradition, including the Greeks, didn't have that. They said, there are so many gods. Gods are trying to be humans and humans are trying to be gods. And they're all fallible. They're all fallible. Whereas God is perfect, God knows everything, and we try to emulate God, right? This is a Christian Judaic issue. So the problem is, in the Chinese I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, the Indian Dharma, nothing is permanent. Everything is changing, right? So we, humanity, must live with nature. In Chinese, 天人合一, man and nature are one. You're part of the whole. You cannot divide the two. Okay? So the point, the difference between the democracy, right, which is your liberty, equality, and fraternity, is that in the Chinese system is really Darwinian. You fight to become number one as emperor, and then if you don't look after our interests, we have the mandate of heaven against you. Any Chinese can rebel against, and then when the guy goes, that man or woman becomes the mandate. He or she, with the same mandate, you look after the people or else. Okay? So it's a very different, but it is what is now called open giant organic systems. Now, who thought of that? The father of modern Chinese science, who was trained in Cornell, Caltech, Chen Xuesen, a Nobel laureate. I know he wasn't a Nobel laureate, right? He went back to China, and he was the first fully trained Western scientist. He came up with the idea in 1993 that the world is a giant, we are dealing with really giant open complex systems. And he's exactly like Atsushi. A brain has got 10 to the power 12 neurons. An individual is a complex open giant system. We are absorbing information every day. When the giant two persons interact with each other, it is an open giant complex system dealing with another one. And if the two of them cannot even understand each other, Because of uncertainty, how can you have the assumption of perfect information as in economics? You know, that assumption begins from day one as being false, right? So what he came up to says, this is exactly his words, reductionism underlying exact science is not suitable to open complex giant systems, and the only feasible alternative is the meta-synthetic engineering from the qualitative to the quantitative, and therefore you really need narratives on top of quantification. So he is synthesized from the Western tradition to the Chinese tradition where he comes from. He synthesized that, all right? And this is why it's pretty critical. Now, how does this synthesize? Well, as you know, in Chinese medicine, the body has many meridian points. You are a complete system. Chinese medicine differs from Western medicine. Western medicine says, you know, I diagnose your problem is the heart, you need open heart surgery, you deal with open heart surgery. The Chinese doesn't think like that. The Chinese thinks that your body, the reason why you are ill is the body is in imbalance. And when it's in imbalance, you either given the medicine to correct the balance, or you use an acupuncture needle, right? The acupuncture goes to the acupuncture point, stick it into it, and release the flow of qi so that the body goes back into balance. That, in Dana Meadows' terms, the Dana Meadows, the limits of growth scientist, is the leverage point, right? So we're looking at harmony, you know, in this issue. Now, this is where I go back to Karl Popper. When I started looking at all this, I said, what the hell is this difference between the East and the West? Well, the East and the West is, you know, you talk about the physical world, and then you have the mental world, and then you have the world of human creativity. Exactly, one becomes two, two becomes three, three becomes more and more complex. Okay? Since I was trained as an accountant, I suddenly realized, hey, the first world is the physical world. The second world is the virtual world. And what is money? Money is virtual representation of the real world, right? Now, the problem with the second world and the third world is the marginal cost of increasing the liability side is zero, or near zero. You can print money with virtually no cost. Imagination is very fertile. The physical world is limited. We are printing money in order to consume our physical world. That's where we are. That's why we get inflation. That's why we get excess debt, right? In 1980, total finance liability was 100% of GDP. Today, it's 486% of GDP. And it's still increasing every year. All right? So we are now living in a world of the metaverse. You know, artificial intelligence, big data, is now able to create a hologram of Jesus Christ or the prophet or Einstein, and you ask it questions and we answer you exactly as everything that Einstein has written about or Jesus Christ has said. Who needs professors? Right? So you know, we are now really in an infinite imaginations world, for which, exactly as Atsushi says, there are many paths. There are no more linear, most direct path. Occam's razor path, gone. There are 1,000 paths, you know, to all this area. So now, what is the control? What's the solution? So now I don't want to be pessimistic. You know, we have to think about if the top-down has been the failure, and it's a failure of the imagination, it's a failure of the paradigm, the solution must be bottom-up. And that's what I want to talk about, why we need to work bottom-up. Now, Richard Feynman said this, right? It is in the very beginning for the human race. Well, I'm not so sure about it. Maybe the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. It's not unreasonable we grapple with problems, but there are tens of thousands of years in the future. Some climate scientists don't think so. We will maybe have only decades, right? Our responsibility is to do what we can, learn what we can, improve the solution, and pass them on.
I think that's absolutely right. That last part I totally agree with. We do what we can. And that's what Dana Meadows actually said. You know, if you have a system problem for which there are physical events, informational patterns of behavior, social structure, conscious models, etc., you leverage, you find the right leverage point, and you change the system. A little bit of effort, you change the system. That is the acupuncture point of Chinese philosophy. So to an extent, Dana Meadows has reinvented the old wisdom that has been forgotten. All right? Now, does it work? How and why? So, to find the third way, we need bottom-up change that do no harm away from false binaries. And actually, the laws of the doctors, do no harm is absolutely right. If all of us had that philosophy, do no harm, it's fine. What the last few years of this US-China rivalry and also the Ukraine war has taught me is that science doesn't work because ultimately every decision a human makes is a moral decision. It's a moral decision. It's not a Bayesian, you know, the computer, you plug into a computer and say that decision is the optimal decision. Rubbish. Whatever decision you make, somebody's going to hurt, somebody's going to win. The only problem is what I really object to are those people who preach equality and deliver inequality. Okay? So what we really now need to do is the triangle, right? It's not 1 and 2. It's a trilemma between the government or the market, which is the typical neoliberal, must be government or the market. They completely forgot about the community. The community. Because the community are the fish in the barrel that either the government shoots or the market shoots. Okay? And today with the internet, the communities are deciding that that's why they've lost trust in both the government and in the market. But the interaction between all three is information. And that's why whoever controls the information controls power. And how is information generated? By energy. And so energy is power. Food, water, right? Energy is power. So power is not political power. Power is power over anything. And human beings have power, right? And power comes from hierarchy. So what's our solution? Well, we know that GDP globalization is really killing us all. We really now need to move to well-being. And that's why people say, think global, act local. Wrong. Think systems, act local. Don't think it's global. Just think of the whole thing as a system. Okay? Right? Now, so the development focus, and that's development. Now, and again, people think, wow, development must mean growth. Not necessarily. Old societies, rich societies that are aging, should be degrowing. There's nothing wrong with aging gracefully and just slowly move up behind the scene. There is a wonderful Japanese movie called The Ballad of Narayama, where the mother over the winter knows that the grandchild will not have enough food. She went up the mountain to die. And to me, that sacrifice enables the young, the new to emerge, rather than the old hanging on and destroying the whole society, right? So in a sense, we need to understand that the atom is not the family, it's actually the village. And in fact, if you go to New York, if you go to Tokyo, you go to London, you realize it's a city full of villages, right? So we really need to move to those closest to nature to help heal nature, to heal ourselves. That philosophy is very critical. So how do we do this, right?
And that is where we use the technology. Now, I'm not totally believe in technology, because technology is like anything else, is a tool. You either use it for the good or you either use it for the bad. But the diagnosis of the problem, that's why I said we need to think about a bottom-up way. And why has been top-down? Because everybody said through the science, we need to concentrate. The more you concentrate, actually, the more you control, easier to control, right? But cities are the worst offenders of climate emission, of pollution. Whereas the rural areas provide the food, they give you well-being because you live with nature, right? And also they capture carbon. They preserve the biodiversity. The cities destroy biodiversity. Okay, after a while, I mean, the picture that Atsushi showed, every city in the world looks identical these days. Higher, taller buildings. They are not sustainable. I'm sorry to say this, although I admire the beauty of some of these architecture, they're not sustainable. Okay? And if they carry on like this, we're really going to get into trouble. So why do we need a smart omni village? Omni means, multiple dimension. The answer is we need to move from ego to eco. Right? And the ego, of course, is Clement Freud. Right? Was it Clement Freud or Sigmund Freud? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry, the timing-wise is getting near. Yeah. So we need, to remove the concentration. We need the disbursement. We need the inclusive. Very fast. So village community, modern cities are disintegrating, alienation, and omni villages get the technology, get the funding, go back to basics, right? And so what is a smart omni village? Well, they use technology. They're decentralized. They're bioregenerative. They're self-sustainable. They're resilient. They're sentient in their community, right? They live with each other. So this is the picture of the village that my wife and I are sponsoring. We brought a whole team of experts, to the village to see what we can do. The needs are very simple. They only need $4,000 to build a bridge, to build a sewage system, to do a composting system, each, right? The different villages. And they have the best knowledge of survival if we have a global nuclear war. All right? So now, the opportunity is weaving together. So we need to create a global creative commons. The best thing that has happened to the world is Wikipedia. Volunteers providing their knowledge so that everybody can share. Now, why don't we use that knowledge to help the villages develop themselves? Well, after all, if I'm a village in Amazon and I have a water problem, I can go into the Wikipedia and say, how do I get this? But if I want to apply to the Gates Foundation, I have to hire a consultant to fill up the many forms to do a PowerPoint presentation. I have to fly to Washington, D.C., and then it'll cost me $100,000, whereas actually what I need is $10,000, right? So there's no funding. I mean, the villages are the community of families. They are open, giant, complex system nested with nature, right? So they will restore our community spirit, and we have neglected them. Okay, I was told that the church actually had all the knowledge of all these indigenous villages, but it's not open knowledge, right? So we can use technology to tackle food, water, mobility, energy, and housing, electricity, etc. Electricity is now available through solar. Electricity is available through, a river, right? Okay, so we can use microgrids. And I'm sorry, the picture is gone, but Japan had installed 6 small turbines in Nepal and actually powered the village. And the minute they have electricity, they can use satellites to get internet, right? And so they can. Sorry, this is that's the Japanese system, right? So cities centralized, villages diversified, and they are best fit for the multitude, right? After COVID, people are moving out to the villages. And we can design the latest systems that do not need imported materials. We can build it through nature, and they save energy. We can save water with everything, right? And the most important of all, we regenerate our food. Okay? During the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia had a poverty problem because they no longer could afford the instant noodles, which is wheat-based. Okay, now if they have grow their proper rice, they can actually have many issues. And permaculture is now regenerative. As you know, when the village that I went to visit, every time they used to plant palm oil, then they use chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizers. Those poison the river, the fish die. The fish die, their protein diet goes down, the diversity of the forest is gone, right? And really, you're condemning them to poverty. So, today, the University of Future starts at a smart village. In Kenyan youth, they're being taught how to teach the AI because they have lots of spare time, their labor is cheap, and they can do a lot of work and be paid literally peanuts, but for them, a lot of money, right? And that technology is completely available, right? So we can help, do local production. In Sabah, there is one lady who actually was very bright. It's very time consuming to generate these weaving. She took a digital photograph, she used 3D printing, pop, pop. Suddenly all the local natives can wear their national uniforms or their tribal uniform at a very cheap price. Complete innovation. So we have a roadmap how to do this. I don't want to talk about this issue, but this is what we need to do now. Because if we connect the villagers in Borneo, in the prime villages to those in Amazon, we can exchange information, how to regenerate the village, how to develop the ecotourism, etc. All right. So this is the pilot that we have, and those are the villages. You see what the problem is? That when I grew up, all this was virgin jungle. Today is all palm oil, right? And so we need to change this. And the villagers realize that they need to get out of this trap, but they don't know how. They don't know how to get the money, right? And the trouble is, if you go to the development banks, the development says the minimum we will lend to you is $100 million US. But as I told you, they only need, maybe $10,000 US or 10,000 euros each on micro projects that will really help, lift them up. And it'd be wonderful if volunteers like you go down to the village. What we're doing is going to give them apps so that they can actually get the data, so that the rest of the world will understand how they perform begging. So to quickly summarize, action begins with self, but work with the community. And that's the collective action trap of Hardin versus the Ostrom. How we do this. And we need to think systemically and act locally. We need a bottom-up narrative. We cannot do no harm. We cooperate, comes from respect for all, willingness to listen despite our differences. And if we allow diversity and encourage it, we will have open emergence rather than closed fragility. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I was wondering if you envision the world of the future as a world that only would consist of these kind of villages.
No, because it's either or and. I don't see the end of cities.
Okay. Yeah, that's
the point is that cities
yeah.
must be symbiotic with surrounding villages.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you. Yeah, I got it.
And yeah, so I we just need to get the balance right.
Yeah.
Sorry, Martin.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
As a former central banker, I think I see a red thread through your entire presentation. From the beginning, thought that there's a connection between monetary systems and ways to deal with climate change. And somewhere in the middle, you have you're thinking about quantum theory. My question is, about 100 years ago, there were some very lively debates among economists about different monetary systems. And there was something called the Chicago Plan and the idea of 100% reserve banking. And at around the same time, there was also an incident that you might know about. There was, I think, the president of the American Association of Political Economy, who gave a talk in 1928, I believe, at their annual convention, and his proposition was, there was a huge upheaval in the physical sciences in the 20 years before that. And we need to take these ideas of relativity theory, the quantum mechanics model, and move away from Newtonian thinking in economics, that kind of thinking. Obviously, neither of those two propositions were realized. So are you saying if we could manage to do that now, 100 years too late, maybe, we would be in a good position to solve these challenges?
Well, the last person to write about climate change was William Jevons, one of the classical economists, because he said, the climate was really due to sunspots, because he had made the observation that when there were sunspots, there were, harvest breakdown, etc. The tragedy about economics was, again, the mathematical tools. Now, Keynes, he is brilliant economist, he wasn't a mathematician. So that's why he wrote the general theory. And he integrated the finance with the real economy. But even better, he integrated the psychology into this. The liquidity trap, the idea that you have to use the state to stimulate the economy out of this. What happened? And this is the real lesson, the failure of Keynesian economics. Paul Samuelson and John Hicks reduced Keynesianism to explain to all the classical economists in classical terms, using classical mathematics. And the minute they did that, actually, of course, the rest of the world then said, wow, Keynes was very good. But Keynes, when he read some of this stuff, he was actually not so sure, because we lost all the animal spirits, all the psychology, all the uncertainty issues, right? And we reduce it to perfection. We reduce it back to equilibrium. And that's where the paradigm goes wrong. Now, how we shift from one paradigm to the next that's where we are. We have the old paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn has said, the old paradigm as dying, more and more anomalies that the existing paradigm cannot explain. We're not saying the new paradigm we reject it. The new paradigm, as we all know, actually subsumes the old paradigm as a special case, right? Okay, suddenly you find that the old classical is a special case, right? Because you assume static, right, not dynamic. You assume determinism, not indeterminism, etc., etc. Okay, so we're really literally at that stage. So it's very difficult. I mean, in my view, Brian has one of the most brilliant economists, because he actually incorporated this. But how do you explain to the mainstream economists, who again threw a few brilliant equations, persuade somebody that's a wonderful is another matter. Okay. Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, I should pose probably a question about path dependence. That a question that occurred to me at the beginning of your talk was when you, well, actually, it is about path dependence. Yeah, you've been pointing to polarization a lot and saying that this binary polarization is actually a great problem in this world. And you can see it in different parts, and this kind of, call it dualism, call it polarization, can also be described as an effect of path dependence to some extent. So there's the connection. I'm not so sure whether yin yang actually solved that problem, because still you've got two poles. I mean, you can mix them continuously in whatever number of shades of gray, but still, is there a three-dimensional version of it, like yin yang yang or something like that?
I unfortunately, you know, I think maybe I go back to that yin yang. Oh, sorry. Oh, can you put it back on?
I mean, in one.
Okay.
book we had
I think Atsushi actually answered you very well, right? You're really not talking about the path dependence. The path dependence is actually linear in the sense that you have to go from A to B to C to D to E. Eventually, you may be able to skip a couple of ones, but de facto is along that path until you get to Z. Okay? What Atsushi was saying, you know, you really need to think about, maybe you're jumping from A to G and go back to C and, you know, then to M, and then eventually you end up with Z. All right. So the path dependence is not linear. It's parallel paths. It's different paths and all this. The thing about, you know, I didn't have a time to explain this. Let me go back to the yin yang. Okay. Now Leibniz, when he actually, how did Leibniz get the ideas from the? He was shown a. Oh, there we go. So yeah, you know, he was shown not this one, but actually a what they call a hexagram. In the hexagram, there's 64 hexagrams, right? The hexagram is basically 4, you know, 16, 32, 64, 128, which is the Leibniz mathematics 01. Okay? What people don't realize in the Chinese thinking using the hexagram is not that you move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then linearly, exactly as the classical thinking, to 64. You can go from 1 to 64 straight away. Now, that kind of thinking is very radical. I mean, just to give you an illustration, one of the problems that we face now with democracy is that we have all to agree, at least 50% all agree, more than 50% agree, before we make a choice. Whereas you look at China, right? You know, basically they were close on the COVID, and overnight after November, somebody decides we flip 180 degrees, we open up completely. Now, in a democracy, it's not easy to make that kind of decisions. Okay, you like Sweden, you trust the doctors, or then you compromise, you trust the economists, and then you trust the doctors, because there's a cost to the lockdown. And then there's the doctors will tell you what you should do. And then we all muddle through. So basically the COVID, the pandemic, was a diverse experimentation on possible. And exactly as what Dan has said, is any particular path better than another? We don't know. We only know after history. Okay? I mean, you know, we have to go back to history to see who is the better path. We don't know at this point of time. Sorry. Does that answer your question?
Not really.
No. I mean, you know, the path dependence, you know, the path dependence cannot be thought as linear path dependence. If you're following a sequence, a known sequence.
I don't think of path dependence in linear terms. The definition I usually use as a path-dependent process is a self-reinforcing process with a tendency towards a lock-in. So it's not this mere path that you can see in graph theory or something, but it's more something like an exponential growth system with a tendency towards a lock-in. So it stabilizes at some point. Maybe you know Brian Arthur's urn model analogy there. When you've got 2 balls in an urn and you pick one of them, one color, and then put one of that color plus the one you've taken back. So then you've got exponential increase, but you can't predict at the beginning on which level it actually will stabilize. But for sure it will stabilize on some relation. So at some point, and while the exponential growth is active, actually you've got this strong self-reinforcing development, and then at some point it stabilizes. But still, it's interesting to actually get a clue about how to tame these kind of dynamics, to think about how the mechanisms can be shaped to actually design somehow the level where it stabilizes, for instance. And
Yeah.
so that's the idea of path
Yeah.
dependence I have in mind.
Well, the path dependence issue is if from a community point of view, for an organization point of view, is how do you actually decide on the next path to take? Okay, right? The leadership problem, which I think Nick explained, was the leader, when the issues are uncertain, the leader has to make that very critical path reversal or path change. I mean, my favorite, and this is my own experience, you know, when you're a leader of an organization, sometimes you have to declare victory and retreat to the rear, advance to the rear, sorry. Because, you know, I mean, I cannot admit defeat, right? So I just have to say I won, but let's tell all my staff we won, but, you know, let's get ready to go backwards. You know, so path dependence, I mean, you know, a lot of your staff would say, carry on, you know, we must do what we need to do. But as a leader, I would realize that, you know, if we carry on that path, we're going to lose even more. So we better retreat. But sorry, Nick.
Just wanted to pick up on one of the things you said. I mean, you sort of echoed what Dan was talking about, this idea of population density and the need maybe to go to the omni-village type concept. You also said that this was, if you like, a manifestation or a need due to the fact that, you know, the old way of thinking, the top-down has, quote, failed, therefore we need, quote, bottom-up. I guess the question I have is, how do you see this wonderful bottom-up move happening without any top-down, let's say, encouragement?
Well, if the top-down doesn't object, then it will work. I mean, you know, this idea actually, you know, came from my understanding of how China works, right? The Chinese work on the basis of delegation to the grassroots level to experiment, right? And if whoever succeeds, then you give them even more resources, okay? And whoever, you know, tries to disrupt the system and make this whole system unstable, that's where you sanction. Right.
So you need both and. You need top down and bottom up.
I'm not asking. I am not asking that you ignore the cities, nor do you ignore the center. It is either or and.
Yeah.
And all I'm suggesting is, development economies now think a little bit more about making well-being. If you want to develop well-being, don't build more high-rise cities. You know, I mean, just move a little bit more people out to the countryside. Use them to develop food security. At the moment, you know, if anything happens to the supply chains, some cities are going to literally die. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to the discussion about financialization.
He was first.
Oh, okay,
Oh,
sorry.
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 Yes.
So I wanted to maybe follow up a little bit on the top-down question and ask something about kind of central banking, right? I guess one question I have that kind of relates to the whole conference is, to what extent do we see maybe people at the top, people who are elites working in central banks, maintaining the illusion of control, in the sense that they're kind of LARPing, they're kind of live action role playing someone who's in control. And there's a kind of mystique that they build up in order to kind of maintain this sense that, say, governments or big companies, they can handle things. And I'm thinking in terms of central banking about Alan Blinder, right, who wrote Central Banking Theory and Practice, where he said, yeah, none of our projection models work. All our projections are completely off, but what we can do is we can average them out and it looks really competent. And that's what we did. And he said, that's good enough for government, right?
But that's no different from shamanism, right?
Yeah. The question is,
You know, there's one famous central banker
which I shall not name in public, who used to be able to tell you, if you understood what I said, you didn't understand what I'm doing.
So the question is, to what, like I work a lot with government, and I see a lot of executives and powerful people investing a lot of their energy into projecting an image and mystique of being in control.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that figures in terms of like this top-down question that you're.
Well, the central bank governor or the leader, has now been shown to be an emperor with no clothes, right? Okay, they claim that they have a lot of power, but they didn't see they didn't, central banking. I'm a former central banker at Mea Culpa, right? The issue is since 2008, they violated everything that former central bankers said they should not do. Walter Bagehot said, in a central bank, when you have a bank run, you lend and lend against collateral at interest rate. They lend at 0 interest rates. Okay? And they're no longer lending on collateral, right? They take any junk bonds and, mortgage securities, equities. And if they can take anything, they can buy the stock market up, right? The Bank of Japan now owns 50% of the issued bonds of the Japanese government, okay? And 50% of the Nikkei 225 ETFs, right? So, these are not small numbers. How can you say that there is a free market when central banks now account for 9% of the global financial assets? Before 2008, around 1980, was 2%. It's gone from 2% to 9%, and it's increasing. So how can you say that I am not involved in the market? The free market still works. I'm sorry, that's shamanism, right? Today, the central bank now, in the latest exercise, the central bank says, against collateral, they will buy back the long-term securities, which are making the banks bankrupt on the mark-to-market rule. They buy it back at par. What is this saying? I am buying your losses and putting it on the central bank's books. Now, the free market says, the free market guys, they make bad mistakes, they pay. How come it is it that the central bank will now buy back your losses, put in the central bank, and all of us pay? They're violating all the basic rules of sound money. And then they claim, not my responsibility. It's the Ministry of Finance that makes the asset allocation decisions.
Your kids.
I don't get it. But they won't listen to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would, on this point, there was a very nice recent documentary, The Age of Easy Money by PBS. That was, I thought, quite enlightening, and also how this in recent years, in order to prop up the stock markets, there has been essentially a huge transfer of wealth in the United States to the ultra wealthy, right? And my point is, or my question rather is, of course, the next financial crisis or crash is coming, and either in 2 years or whatever, 5 years, 10 years. And I wonder if that might be the moment to, reset, and not reset by fueling even bigger bubble, but to move away from the system. And with your experience as a central banker, I wonder what can be done, not just to make a reset toward a financial system that is actually had some basis in biophysical reality, because what is happening is also that we create this money out of thin air, but it's also a claim on future resources, right? Resource extraction in the future. And I wonder what can be done when the next crisis hits to move toward a standard system, because I don't see that happening without a crisis.
The problem today is that things are so complex. It is very difficult for the man in the street to decide who is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we've lost trust in the system.
Yeah.
The people who are supposed to be fiduciary, look after our interests, are on the basis of looking after our interests, happens to be making the system worse.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so how do you blame your drug dealer who's giving you more drugs? That's the problem.
Maybe the question is not about blaming, but
No,
what
no,
can
no,
be
no,
done?
no, but the problem is, you know, if I am suffering from a drug withdrawal, my immediate reaction is just, please print more money to help me out. And it is a serious moral issue. And the way we hide from this is to say, not my fault, the decision is not mine. It is to do with the Ministry of Finance, right? And the Ministry of Finance will depend on Parliament. And Parliament says, well, you know, if you can print more money, why don't you do it? So nobody blames anybody, and the Titanic is still moving forward. That's the fundamental global problem that we're facing.
Maybe we can take that as your last final words of warning our society in general.
Well, it's very difficult being Cassandra.
All right. I want to sort of have one more round of applause. Then